Imagine an incident so deeply personal, so unsettling, that it launches its author into a decades-long investigation into what he claims is a secret, centuries-old global conspiracy. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a book that starts with exactly that kind of visceral, shocking event.
That's right. For this deep dive, we're going to unpack Rabbi Marvin S. Antelman's highly controversial and intricately detailed book, To Eliminate the Opiate, Volume 1. It presents a truly sweeping narrative of what the author claims is a covert effort spanning centuries, aimed specifically at destroying Judaism and, in the process, reshaping the entire world order.
And for you, our listener, our mission is to understand what this author claims. We're here to navigate Antelman's dense, interconnected arguments, to extract his core claims, trace the historical figures he identifies, and lay out the complex web of associations and motivations he describes.
Exactly. You'll gain a comprehensive understanding of this specific perspective, allowing you to grasp the intricate narrative as presented within these pages. We're here to be your guides through this extraordinary lens on history, exploring the claims as the author lays them out.
All right, let's dive in. Let's begin where the author himself begins, with a singular, deeply personal, and frankly terrifying event that, in Antelman's account, grounds his entire decades-long investigation. It starts with the firebombing of a Jewish home on Callender Street in Dorchester, Massachusetts, on July 11th, 1971.
Yeah, this was, as he describes it, a real tangible act of violence.
And followed this horrific incident was a legal battle that quickly pulled the author, Rabbi Marvin S. Antelman, into the center of a larger conflict. As the national coordinator of the Jewish Survival Legion, or JSL, Rabbi Antelman found himself sued by Elma Lewis, who he identifies as a militant black leader operating in Boston at the time.
Right. And a detail Antelman highlights immediately jumps out. Lewis's lawyers were from the American Jewish Congress, and one of the partners, Lawrence Shubo, is reported in Antelman's account to have been linked to communist activities in U.S. Senate hearings.
Shubo was also, at the time, vice president of the New England region of the American Jewish Congress. Antelman even includes a letter from Shubo threatening a $500,000 lawsuit. So what was Antelman's takeaway from this specific, seemingly contradictory detail?
Well, Antelman sees this as an early indication of the pattern he felt he was beginning to uncover. He makes it clear that this firebombing wasn't, in his view, an isolated incident. He describes it as part of a series of incidents that had begun to afflict Boston's Jewish community starting from 1968.
And the scale he describes is, well, it's shocking.
It really is,
That's
from his
horrifying.
perspective. Synagogues were destroyed, Torahs were burned, Jews were mercilessly beaten and robbed. He claims over 250 Jews were killed during this period in Boston.
And to truly emphasize the devastation he describes, the author draws a stark and frankly unsettling comparison. He claims the total figures for rapes, robberies, and murders in Boston during this period exceeded those of the infamous Kishinev pogrom of 1904.
Which is a huge claim. And furthermore, he claims that approximately 60,000 Jews were forcibly expelled from the community, a number that, according to him, exceeded the forced exile of 16,000 Jews from England way back in 1290.
So he's framing this as a crisis of historical proportions.
Exactly. And it was in response to this perceived crisis that the Jewish Survival Legion, or JSL, was formed. Rabbi Antelman, along with what he calls kindred spirits, veterans of the Zionist revisionist Beitar and the Irgun, initially joined the Jewish Defense League, the JDL.
Okay.
But by late 1970, they left the JDL as a group. Antelman cites basic differences of philosophy with Rabbi Meir Kahane. They then went on to form the JSL, which was affiliated with Herut and Beitar.
So after Elma Lewis's legal action against him, Antelman states he mobilized the entire apparatus at his disposal through the JSL and its sister organizations.
Right. This meant thoroughly scrutinizing the backgrounds of Elma Lewis and, crucially, the Jewish individuals who, in Antelman's view, supported her and aided, as he puts it, in the destruction of Boston Jewry.
And this is where, as he describes it, a certain pattern began to emerge. What did Antelman's investigation reveal about this pattern, and why was it so significant to him?
Well, he describes an initial reluctance to pursue this pattern, fearing it would lead to what he calls a Joseph McCarthy witch hunt. But the investigation, from his perspective, uncovered intimate connections between those in the Jewish community involved with Elma Lewis and what he terms communist or Marxist-Leninist Third World Coalition organizations.
Okay.
He notes their prior experience observing how Red Chinese Maoists had worked together in spawning the Black Panthers, whom he points out were openly professing communist ideology at the time.
But the truly surprising discovery, Antelman claims, was finding that certain members of the Reformed clergy in Boston subscribed to similar philosophies and had links to these groups.
Yes, he offers specific examples from his investigation. For instance, he points to Albert Axelrad, the Reform Hill chaplain at Brandeis University. He describes Axelrad as pro-Black Panther and as having published articles claiming one could be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic.
He also names Roland Gittleson of Reform Temple Israel.
Right, stating that Gittleson had aligned himself with communist causes throughout his life. And another clergyman, Judea Miller, a Reformed congregation in Maine, Massachusetts, is cited as having fully supported Elma Lewis and the local Malcolm X Foundation.
And Antelman dedicates a significant amount of detail, really a dossier, to Gittleson's alleged affiliations. What's the core point he's trying to make with this?
He presents Gittleson as a prime example of the pattern he observed. He lists affiliations with groups like the American Congress for Peace and Democracy, the Mid-Century Conference for Peace, which he notes was cited as subversive by the U.S. Attorney General, the National Committee to Repeal the McCarran Act, the National Committee to Abolish the House of Un-American Activities.
Not a long list.
A very long list. He mentions Gittleson's name appearing in the Communist Worker, signing a statement for Red China's UN admission. And Antelman points out Red China's alleged El Fatah training camp and anti-Israel propaganda. He lists Gittleson as an advisor to the Congress of Racial Equality, which Antelman claims supported much of the Black anti-Semitic activity, signing a clemency petition for imprisoned communists, joining a tribute to W.E.B. Du Bois.
Okay, so the takeaway Antelman wants to convey here is this alleged historical entrenchment of, well, subversive ideology within segments of the reform movement, using Gittleson as a case study.
Precisely. So after collecting all this information and sending it, he says, to Bet Jabotinsky in Israel, Antelman decided to pursue an idea. It was based on comments he attributes to Hebrew University professor Gershom Scholem.
Scholem, the renowned scholar of Jewish mysticism.
Yes. Scholem had reportedly discussed a connection between the radical 17th century Sabbatian movement and the 18th century Frankists, both considered heretical movements with both reform and conservative movements, and also the Jacobins of the French Revolution. That's quite a mix.
It is. Antelman's thesis then became to investigate a connection between these modern movements within Judaism reform and conservative, and communism potentially rooted in these older heresies.
And what was the shocking finding, as he describes it, that emerged from this deep dive into history?
What Antelman claims he found was, well, staggering to him. This thesis was not only to be valid, but it appeared that there was a conspiracy in history to hide this relationship.
A conspiracy to hide it.
That's his claim. He asserts that the more obstacles he encountered in his research, from outright denials to the alleged suppression of historical documents, the more determined he became to dig and to continue digging to unwind the entire puzzle. For Antelman, these obstacles weren't deterrents, they were further proof of the conspiracy's existence and its efforts to remain hidden.
And as for Antelman's intent in writing the book and any, warnings for the reader, he's quite explicit. He states the book aims to enlighten readers about this conspiracy to destroy the Jewish religion, which he claims depends on being able to hide its inner workings. He believes that by reading the book, you, the reader, will be that much more enlightened, comparing it to a Torah admonition against concealing evil.
So reading the book is part of disrupting the conspiracy, in his view.
That's the idea presented. He also clarifies that while the book primarily addresses the Jewish experience, he tried to write it for non-Jews as well, so they could better appreciate how an attack on Judaism affects their lives, and maybe realize who the real conspirators are, according to him.
And critically, he adds a caveat about his sources.
Yes, very important. He states that while he quotes many authorities like Scholem, Hertzberg, Demont, Katz, he does not accept many of those that he has quoted as authorities in all matters. He explicitly notes their perceived biases, for example, Scholem as an agnostic, Jacob Katz subscribing to biblical criticism, Arthur Hertzberg attacking the Israeli rabbinate. So he's using their scholarship selectively to support his points while also critiquing them.
And the title itself, To Eliminate the Opiate.
It's a direct lift, a direct incorporation of Karl Marx's famous concept of religion as the opiate of the people, setting the stage for the connection he intends to draw.
Okay, moving on to the ideological thread Antelman weaves. He makes a rather striking claim right off the bat, that Karl Marx did not, in fact, originate the Communist Manifesto.
No, instead, Antelman claims Marx was essentially paid for his services, hired by a secret society known in Germany as the League of the Just, or the Bundergerechten.
the Bund der Gerechten. And how does Antelman trace the lineage of this organization? Where does he say it came from?
Antelman asserts that this Bund, which he says eventually became known as the International Communist Party, has origins that are lost in obscurity. However, he states that many political scientists, he doesn't specify which ones, believed it was largely influenced by another secretive organization, the Illuminati.
The Bavarian Illuminati.
That's the one. Founded, he says, by Bavarian intellectual Adam Weishaupt, who Antelman believes was an ex-Jesuit on May 1st, 1776. And Antelman directly attributes May Day's prominent status in Marxist-Leninist organizations to this founding date, suggesting this deeper, hidden continuity.
So a direct line from the Illuminati to the group that commissioned Marx.
That's the connection he draws. And Weishaupt's vision for a new social order wasn't, according to Antelman, entirely original either. He claims it was guided by the ancient model of Plato's Republic.
Plato. How does he connect Weishaupt to Plato?
He draws a direct parallel. Just as Plato's Republic provided for three classes of people, ruling, working, and military, so too, Antelman claims, did the Illuminati. He points to its highest mystery class, comprising grades of priest, regent, magus, and king, which he sees as analogous to Plato's philosopher kings or rulers.
And he focuses on some of Plato's more radical ideas.
He really does. He emphasizes them as foundational to this new order, the complete elimination of marriage and the family, with all women belonging to all men, and vice versa. Children born from these unions raised anonymously by the state, and the state's elimination of those considered defective.
Which Antelman frames very negatively.
Extremely negatively. He calls Plato's Republic nothing more than a crystallization of the worst aspects of Hellenism. And he stresses that Judaism, in contrast, victoriously fought this Hellenistic worldview in a life-and-death struggle during the Maccabean battles, roughly 200 years after Plato, battling for basic morality and religious freedom. For Antelman, this isn't ancient history. It's an ongoing ideological battle.
He then extends this idea of hidden structures to modern times, claiming that in the modern Communist Party, these three classes, ruler, military, workers, still exist.
Right, but he asserts that the public tends to think of communism as an order catering to the working classes. Unaware, he claims, that very powerful, wealthy men living in free societies of the world today are its kings and priests.
These are the secret manipulators.
That's the claim, that these individuals secretly manipulate and control most communist governments and Marxist-Leninist activities worldwide, seeing themselves as the masterminds, the rulers of a new world order.
That's a huge claim. How does Antelman try to physically demonstrate the existence of this alleged secret power structure in the modern world? Does he offer any sort of tangible proof?
Well, as evidence of this concept existing in the free world, he points to something specific. A monument he describes in the lobby of the Harry S. Truman Peace Institute of the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem.
Okay, what does he describe seeing there?
He describes a mysterious painting from which three strands emanate and unite to form one bond, which he claims represents these three classes of secret rulers. Furthermore, outside the building, he notes prominent names inscribed on a monument, names that were linked by the historian Carroll Quigley.
Carroll Quigley, author of Tragedy and Hope.
Yes. Antelman states Quigley revealed the names of the inner communist circle, a revelation for which Quigley was apparently condemned. But Quigley, Antelman notes, felt the revolution had progressed so far that the revelation wouldn't cause any harm anyway.
So Antelman sees this institute itself as a symbol.
He concludes that this Abandoned Peace Institute is a manifestation of the highest so-called Jewish echelons of world communism. And their aim, he asserts, is to destroy the basic universal morality that Judaism holds sacred, as well as its religious practices.
So connecting these threads to the bigger picture, Antelman claims that the new social order schemed by these masterminds was to be realized by three distinct types of revolution: economic, political, and, crucially, religious.
Exactly. These schemes, Antelman asserts, were effectuated at clandestine meetings of the Bund der Gerechten in the early 19th century. And he claims it was Karl Marx who simply articulated communism's underlying Hellenistic ideology when he famously declared that religion is the opiate of the people.
And while the world knows the economic and political revolutions, the Bolsheviks, China, Cuba...
Right, Antelman states that the religious revolution has been most carefully guarded by the communist hierarchy. And it is precisely this religious revolution, especially as it pertains to Judaism, that he aims to expose as its deepest, most hidden layer.
He then expands on the Bund's alleged internal subversion. He claims the original inner circle included born Catholics, Protestants, and Jews.
And he alleges it was the apostate representatives of these respective groups who formulated schemes for the ultimate destruction of their faiths.
And why Judaism as a primary target?
Because, Antelman claims, the Jewish religion was seen as the mother of two great Western religions, Christianity and the Muslim faith. Therefore, it naturally became a primary target for destruction. He states that compulsive hatred for the Jewish religion was manifested throughout the rise of world communism.
He even points the finger at Marx himself.
He does. He points to Karl Marx, born Jewish, but whose family converted to Christianity when he was 6. Antelman claims Marx himself helped promote anti-Semitism in the United States through his reports for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. He quotes Marx as writing, "Thus we find every tyrant backed by a Jew," and describing a Jewish organization of loanmongers as dangerous to the people.
Which leads Antelman to the assertion that communism itself is inherently anti-Semitic.
Yes. He cites Congressman Gordon Scherer of the House Committee of Un-American Activities, who, according to Antelman, was convinced from the testimony of many people, including prominent Jews, that the Communist Party was anti-Semitic and is as anti-Semitic as Hitler ever was.
That's a very strong statement.
It is. Antelman explains this by stating that communism is inexorably committed to atheism, while Judaism is inexorably committed to monotheism, which he describes as the root of religious beliefs of the Western world today.
He also draws that parallel between National Socialism and International Socialism.
Right, asserting they are ideologically identical, except that the Nazi-fascist type of dictatorship could care less about international socialists. It's the international versus national scope that's the main difference in this view.
This prompts a fundamental question in Antelman's analysis. Why this profound hatred for the Jew? What are the underlying reasons Antelman put forward for this antipathy, beyond purely religious differences?
Antelman posits several reasons. In addition to what he calls a conscious and subconscious hatred of the Jew for his religious beliefs and practices, he claims the Jew is also despised for his entrepreneurship and rugged individualism.
Rugged individualism.
Yeah, and he notes this hatred wasn't confined to Jews, citing Stalin's extermination of several million kulaks, Russian peasants, who also professed a unique, rugged individualism. Antelman argues that in the communist state, the state is supreme. The importance of family, property rights, even human life are all subservient to the state.
So traditional Jewish values are a threat.
They're presented as a direct threat. The concept of the divine presence in man, which he says reflects itself in the behavior of the religious Jew, emphasizing sanctity of life, family, property, was considered a threat to the state because these values made the state appear demeaning and barbaric in contrast.
And he brings into this discussion the 7 commandments of the sons of Noah, also known as the laws of universal morality. How does he connect these ancient laws to the broader ideological battle he describes?
He presents these laws, prohibitions against idol worship, blasphemy, homicide including abortion and euthanasia, illicit sexual relations, theft, cruelty to animals, plus the positive command for laws and courts, including capital punishment as the root of religious beliefs of the Western world today.
Okay.
He argues that the religious Jew tenaciously clings to these, seeing them as the source of the divine presence in man. For Antelman, these are the fundamental moral principles that the communist-driven religious revolution, this hidden revolution, aims to dismantle entirely.
This all culminates in Antelman's overarching claim that the Bunz masterminds were a handful of super-rich. Now, he acknowledges the bitterly ironic abuse of the world conspiracy concept by anti-Semitic propaganda like the protocols of the elders of Zion. So how does Antelman differentiate his claims from those narratives?
It's a fine line he tries to walk. He clarifies that while the protocols were published by Tsar Nicholas II, who he agrees was a virulent anti-Semite, they may have been published because the Tsar had a personal axe to grind with specific banking families, the Schiffs, the Warburgs, and the Rothschilds, whom Antelman claims were already planning a revolution in Russia.
So the Tsar's motives were personal, according to Antelman.
That's part of his argument. He claims Jacob Schiff was giving immense financial aid to the Japanese against the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War, for which Schiff was decorated by the Japanese Mikado. Antelman asks rhetorically, if Schiff was such a loyal Jew, why did he finance the Japanese who caused the death of thousands of Jewish men who were used as cannon fodder for the Tsar?
So, Antelman argues that the Tsar ironically hurt his own cause by publishing the protocols.
Yes, because it allowed anyone genuinely committed to exposing a conspiracy to be immediately labeled as a bigot, effectively providing cover. Antelman asserts that the truth of the matter was that there was a conspiracy, But it was neither Jewish, nor Catholic, nor Masonic. It involved people of all types of religious and national backgrounds.
And then he names names.
Then he names names, side by side, Rockefellers and Morgans, and then those Jews who were of special interest, the Schiffs, Warburgs, and most of the Rothschilds. He positions them as part of this transnational, super-rich elite driving the conspiracy.
And he points again to Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope.
Right, presenting it as the best reference to these masterminds. Quigley, described by Antelman as a leftist, apparently considered those who opposed the communist revolution as the tragedy they were doomed, and those committed to it as the hope. Quigley, Antelman notes, believed little people cannot turn back the tide, and that it was time the great men were acknowledged for their accomplishments.
Quigley essentially spilled the beans, in Antelman's view.
That's how Antelman presents it, yes. And on the financial backing side, Antelman specifically claims Jacob Schiff gave $20 million to the Bolshevik Revolution. He adds that a year after Schiff's death, the Bolsheviks allegedly deposited over 600 million rubles into Schiff's banking firm, Kuhn and Loeb.
Linking the financiers directly to the revolutionaries.
Directly. Antelman then elaborates on the Schiff family's alleged role in religious subversion, stating that Jacob Schiff and his family played a prominent role in developing the reform and conservative apostate Jewish movements.
Apostate movements.
That's his term. He claims they aided them at critical stages of their development in putting into action the demonic master plan to undermine all world religions through fragmentation and divide-and-conquer tactics.
Which leads to the specific strategy Antelman describes for Judaism.
Yes. The belief that if Jews could be fragmentized and irreversibly split, success in implementing the religious revolution would be achieved. This, he claims, included developing their own network of rabbinical seminaries to ordain their own fraudulent rabbis. It's a key point suggesting a deliberate internal subversion orchestrated from the top, rather than just an external attack.
Okay, so with the ideological groundwork and financial backing allegedly established, Antelman then moves to the operational phase. He details how the Bund, the secret society, supposedly set about creating these phony Judaisms, as he calls them, within the Jewish world.
Right, and he points to one figure in particular, Abraham Geiger, who lived from 1810 to 1874. Antelman identifies Geiger as the Bund's primary personality, chosen to implement the reform movement in Judaism.
So Geiger was their man on the inside, so to speak. But how was he controlled or integrated into this larger plan, according to Antelman?
Antelman describes Geiger's engagement to Emily Oppenheim as lasting an unusual 7 years. Why? Because, he claims, it was contrived by the super-rich.
Contrived how?
Emily, Antelman states, was the granddaughter of Gumbel Oppenheim, who he identifies as an inner-circle mastermind of the 1848 Communist Revolution in Germany. So the marriage itself was strategic, in this view.
But he notes they were genuinely in love.
Yes, despite this alleged manipulation, Antelman notes that Abraham and Emily Geiger were deeply in love. But their marriage, he argues, was conceived under sinister circumstances, specifically to serve the Bund's agenda.
And during this long engagement, Geiger was essentially being tested.
Exactly. Antelman claims he was on trial. He was given those 7 years to formulate an effective theology of Reform Judaism. And according to Antelman, Geiger delivered.
How so?
He founded a radical society for Jewish theology in Germany, set up a dynamic organizational structure for reform in 1835, and convened the first formalized conference of Reform rabbis in 1837. By 1850, largely due to Geiger's efforts, Antelman asserts reform became the dominant Jewish schism in Germany.
Though Antelman adds a crucial caveat.
Yes, he emphasizes that the status of such Jews from God's Torah perspective was now in danger. And for his smashing success, Geiger was, according to Antelman, rewarded again by having a marriage arranged between his nephew and a Schiff girl. Another strategic alliance in this narrative.
And Antelman emphasizes the human cost of this alleged manipulation.
He does. He talks about the Bund's calculating callousness for human beings and human emotions, manifested by how thousands of lives were manipulated. He states that people attracted to reform generally accepted the movement at face value, little realizing, he claims, that their acceptance of this heresy would cause their descendants to be totally lost to Judaism.
They didn't know they were pawns.
That's the assertion. Nor, he claims, did they realize they were being played for fools on the altars of ambition, success, and politics. The Bund, he asserts, conceived the ultimate plans for the secularization and destruction of Judaism.
A core part of this strategy, according to Antelman, involved manipulating terminology itself. He makes a fascinating claim about the word orthodox.
Yes, this is quite striking. He states that the term Orthodox was first applied to Jews in connection with Napoleon's Sanhedrin, maybe around 1806, 1807. But then, he claims, it was later used by Reform Judaism specifically to relegate authentic Jews to a reactionary sect.
He says it was intended as derogatory.
Explicitly. He states the term Orthodox was intended to be used as a bigoted, derogatory term, in the same manner that a white bigot would employ the term nigger. He even notes that Karl Marx himself used the term nigger in a diatribe called the Jewish nigger, to, as Antelman puts it, indeed degrade all Jews.
Wow. So this labeling was part of a larger divide and conquer strategy.
That's exactly how Antelman frames it, part of the divide and conquer psychology of the communist movement, which he says has fomented revolution by accentuating differences between blacks and whites, Asiatics and Occidentals, youth and elders, and so on, including within Judaism itself.
How did they allegedly foment division within Judaism?
To further this division, Antelman claims a scheme was developed to promote the branch concept through scholarly circles. He asserts that Judaism, which he argues had never historically had branches like Protestantism, was now to be praised for its diversity. Anyone who spoke of a united Judaism, he claims, was to be sneered at as an ignoramus.
And Geiger played a role in this intellectual justification.
According to Antelman, yes. Geiger sought to resurrect the conflict of the Sadducees and Pharisees through his scholarly studies, subtly planting the idea that branch and schism were not new to Judaism.
But Antelman argues this was intellectually dishonest.
Completely dishonest in his view. He asserts Geiger and his colleagues failed to tell the masses that while groups like the Sadducees and Karaites had existed, Judaism had only survived via the Pharisees and Rabbinites. And crucially, he claims, even their historical opponents never dared question the basic validity of the concept of Torah min Hashamim.
Torah min Hashamim, Torah from heaven. Can you elaborate again on why that concept is so central to Antelman's argument here?
Absolutely. Torah min Hashamim is the foundational belief in traditional Judaism that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was directly revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. It establishes the Torah's divine authorship and absolute authority. Antelman makes the critical distinction that both Reform and Conservative Judaism stand outside its pale because both hold that God did not write the Torah, but rather that men created it.
Even Conservative Judaism.
Yes, in his view.
Yeah.
He says Conservative Judaism differed from Reform only in that it wished to conserve practices for cultural importance, not because they stem from divine revelation. So for Antelman, this rejection of divine authorship is the ultimate heresy, the core subversion, making these movements fundamentally illegitimate from a traditional perspective.
And this erosion of authentic Judaism, Antelman explains, wasn't instantaneous. It was gradual, a process of creeping changes.
Right, he illustrates this gradual shift. The very first reform service in 1807, led by Israel Jacobson, whom Antelman calls an Illuminati-Bundis, introduced only one slight change, translating the Yichem Pirkem prayer from Aramaic into German.
Seemingly minor.
Seemingly. Further innovations like instrumental music came in 1810. Yet, Antelman claims, as late as the 1930s, German reform hadn't even psychologically accepted the mixing of the sexes in its worship. He points to the Frankfurt Reform Society's Declaration of Principles in 1843, which recognized unlimited development in the Mosaic religion and rejected the Talmud's authority.
And he contrasts the original reformers with modern ones.
Drastically. He claims that while the original reformers still embrace the universal ethics of the Noahide laws, their modern followers are now, as he puts it, calling for abolition of capital punishment, endorsing abortion, justifying the tolerance of criminal elements, approving of adultery and illicit sexual relations, incorporating homosexual congregations, and finding praise for atheistic rabbis. Some, he even says, have found room for Jesus in the Jewish scheme of things.
So for Antelman, this trajectory shows a deliberate step-by-step dismantling of core Jewish values.
Exactly, a planned erosion.
So with these organizational structures for the reform movement gaining ground in Germany, Antelman claims the Bund decided it was time to expand, to export its heresies to Russia.
Yes, and for this mission they selected Dr. Max Lilienthal, who lived from 1814 to 1882.
And how did Lilienthal fare initially?
According to Antelman, he was partially successful. In 1840, he managed to open a Jewish school in Riga, where he could, in Antelman's words, implant the seeds of destruction against Judaism. By December 1841, he'd laid the groundwork for government-sponsored Jewish secular schools in Russia.
But his efforts are ultimately thwarted.
Yes, Antelman asserts Lilienthal's efforts were completely dissipated by the power and influence of the great Lubavitcher Chassidic rabbi of that time, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, known as the Tzimach Tzedek.
That's Tzimach Tzedek.
Right. Antelman calls this a stunning defeat for the Bund, one that heightened extreme disdain for Russian Jews and figures like Jacob Schiff, because it showed that traditional Judaism could actually resist their engineered subversion.
And Lilienthal wasn't working alone.
No, Antelman claims his mission was exercised through a Bund-controlled committee of reform functionaries. He gives us a glimpse into the alleged ruthlessness of this committee by detailing the actions of one member, Homburg.
What kind of actions does Antelman attribute to Homburg?
He paints a picture of someone actively hostile to traditional Judaism. Homburg, Antelman states, attempted to impose a tax on Sabbath candles in Germany in 1795, was convicted of misappropriating funds in 1801, published a booklet in 1810 attempting to discredit religious Jews as unfit for marriage, and from 1814 to 1841 served as inspector of Jewish schools in Bohemia, where he reportedly succeeded in destroying the Jewish parochial school system.
So financial manipulation, propaganda, direct attacks on education.
That's the pattern Antelman presents. He also highlights Lilienthal's own subversive connections. He arrived in Riga, Antelman says, with a letter of introduction from the King of Bavaria, allegedly influenced by the Bund. Lilienthal then supposedly ingratiated himself with Prince Lichtenberg of Russia, son-in-law of the anti-Semitic Tsar Nicholas VI. Lichtenberg, an atheist himself, was under surveillance by the Tsar's secret police, which automatically made Lilienthal a suspect for political subversion.
But Lilienthal didn't know he was also being watched by someone else.
Apparently not. Unknown to Lilienthal, Antelman claims, his movements were carefully watched by the Tzimach Tzedek. He describes the Rebbe's intelligence network as so thorough and complete that it could easily compete with our own CIA and FBI.
A bold claim.
Very. This network, Antelman claims, discovered Lilienthal's plan, which originated from a German Enlightenment society, a Bund front, in his view. The plan called for closing traditional Jewish publishing houses, destroying harmful literature, meaning traditional texts, and establishing mandatory Russian language schools for Jews, all designed, Antelman argues, to dismantle traditional Jewish learning and identity.
And Lilienthal allegedly resorted to personal attacks.
Antelman claims he engaged in malice and character assassination against the rabbis, particularly the Tzimach Tzedek, accusing him of being a persecutor of culture, of sending special emissaries to prevent Jewish youths from military service, and publishing separatism books.
And these weren't just words.
No. Lilienthal and his cohorts in Russia, Antelman states, launched concerted attacks against the Torah and Judaism. Agents spied on the Tzimach Tzedek, instigated scores of denunciatory letters to government ministries, charging Jewish leaders and merchants with everything from rebellion and contempt for Christianity to misappropriation, smuggling, bribery, and usury.
He even tried to turn the government against the Tzimach Tzedek directly.
Yes. Antelman claims Lilienthal tried to impress Count Uvarov, the Minister of Culture, by asserting that the rabbis condoned unethical iniquities with Gentiles and preached separatism, singling out the saintly Tzimach Tzedek as the worst offender.
But this narrative was challenged.
It was, according to Antelman, by M.A. Gunsberg. Gunsberg was an intellectual, initially influenced by Lilienthal, but described as intellectually honest. He undertook a 6-month journey studying Hasidic Jews in their communities.
And what did Gunsberg find?
He concluded that the rabbis were men of fine character and unusual intellect, and that the laymen studied Torah and manifested piety and virtue everywhere. Gunsberg, much to Lilienthal's reported chagrin, concluded that his German mentors were full of misinformation. This independent verification, Antelman suggests, significantly undermined Lilienthal's propaganda efforts.
Despite this, the pressure on traditional Judaism continued. The Tsars forced conscription laws.
Right, Antelman notes those laws led to thousands of conversions to Christianity between 1842 and 1854. But the Tzimach Tzedek, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, held his ground.
How so?
On May 6, 1843, at the first meeting of a government commission aimed at finalizing Jewish assimilation, the Tzimach Tzedek stood strongly in opposition. He declared, according to the account, that he and his colleagues were prepared to suffer death rather than to transgress fundamental Jewish law.
And there were consequences for this defiance.
Yes. Antelman states he was placed under house arrest by Count Uvarov no less than 22 times during the commission's proceedings. Antelman describes this whole episode as Lilienthal's worst defeat of his career in Russia, a testament in his eyes to the resilience of traditional Jewish leadership against the Bund's designs.
And Lilienthal's reputation suffered immensely.
Terribly, according to Antelman. His name became synonymous with atheist, then filthy German apostate, and he was hated by the masses. Realizing his mission had failed, Lilienthal immediately wrote to Abraham Geiger back in Germany, urging him to come to Russia to save the ship from sinking.
Which brings us back to Geiger, and a significant turning point in Antelman's narrative regarding the Bund's strategy. Why did Geiger, the Bund's chosen architect of reform, suffer what Antelman calls perhaps the worst defeat of his entire career, with his non-appointment as head of the Breslau Seminary?
Antelman claims this failure. Geiger not getting the top post at Breslau led directly to the birth of conservative Judaism.
How does he make that connection?
Instead of the planned Geiger Seminary, the Bund, Antelman argues, pivoted. They opened the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau in 1854, but headed it with Rabbi Zechariah Frankel. This was, in Antelman's view, a deliberate move to invent another movement, conservative Judaism.
Why invent another movement?
To fill the gap between religious traditionalists and the extremes of Reform Judaism, thereby creating further cause for dissension and, critically, a new, perhaps more subtle avenue for subversion within the Jewish world.
And how did conservative Judaism differ in Antelman's analysis?
He claims conservative Judaism still believed in the critical treatment of religious documents, meaning it couldn't accept the Torah as divinely authored. However, unlike Reform, it wished to conserve practices, but mainly for cultural reasons, not because of divine command.
Still rejecting the core principle of divine revelation.
Exactly. Antelman stresses that, according to Jewish law, rejecting even one word of the Torah as being of divine origin is to be cut off from his people. Therefore, conservative Judaism, in his view, was just another Jewish escape from Judaism, packaged differently. This subtle difference for Antelman was a calculated tactical maneuver by the Bund.
And despite all his earlier efforts for the Bund, Antelman asserts that Geiger himself was clearly double-crossed in this Breslau affair.
Yes, he emphasizes that the Bund had financed Geiger since his college days, making him financially dependent, at the mercy of the Bund. He claims they used filthy and underhanded tactics to set him up in Breslau, only to pull the rug out from under him.
And he links this directly to the Illuminati.
He does. He reveals that the Bund's front organization in Breslau, the one agitating for Geiger's appointment, was an Illuminati lodge. The Gesellschaft der Brüder, Society of Brethren, founded way back in 1779.
So this led to significant controversy and an alleged cover-up.
A huge controversy. When Geiger was invited to be a guest preacher at the Breslau synagogue before the seminary decision, the chief rabbi, Salomon A. Ticktin, protested vehemently. Ticktin, Antelman notes, accused Geiger of attacking religion, being unfit for rabbinical office as merely a university graduate, violating the Sabbath, and defying a Prussian cabinet decree against religious innovations.
And there were political suspicions, too.
Yes, Antelman claims Geiger was also linked with suspect political circles and tendencies. He asserts that a police investigation into Geiger was whitewashed through immense bribes to hide his political affiliation. This further corroborated, he argues, by the fact that Geiger's close friend and revolutionary, Berthold Auerbach, had been imprisoned in 1837 for radical activities, a fact Antelman states the Encyclopedia Judaica conveniently obliterates entirely.
Antelman then analyzes Geiger's first Breslau sermon, claiming it was deliberately subversive. How does he interpret it?
He asserts Geiger was laying the foundation for the overthrow of Judaism in that very sermon. He claims Geiger spoke on two levels, using double meanings for insiders for the initiated.
Can you give an example of this alleged doublespeak?
Certainly. For instance, Antelman claims phrases like fruitful changes didn't just mean progress. They referred specifically to the communist conspiracy's plans for societal upheaval. When Geiger spoke of having wrested recognition from those who hold sway in proud palaces, Antelman interprets this as a veiled reference to Carroll Quigley's world system of financial control in private hands, suggesting a coded defiance of the established financial elite, even while ironically being backed by some of them, according to Antelman.
And Princes of Peace.
Antelman claims it meant the exact opposite. It was code for promoting dissent and subversive activities. Geiger, Antelman says, spoke of unlimited development in the Mosaic religion and claimed that while the outer form is subject to change, the essence of things remains intact. But he added that if the outer form should seek to assert itself independently, it will be stale and meaningless. For Antelman, this was a carefully crafted message designed to hollow out religious tradition from within, leaving only an empty shell.
Following his fall from the Breslau appointment, Antelman claims Geiger retaliated against the Bund. How?
In 1854, the year the Breslau Seminary opened under Frankl, Geiger issued a new, more traditional prayer book. Antelman called this a slap in the face to the reform movement he had helped build, a way of signaling his displeasure.
And meanwhile, Lilienthal.
Lilienthal, after the Russia fiasco, could never come back to Germany, Antelman says. He went to the U.S., where reform rabbis had mass exodus after the failed 1848 revolutions in Europe. There, Antelman claims, they built a political power base unhampered.
But Geiger wasn't left out in the cold for long.
No. Despite the double cross, Antelman says Geiger was reinstated to his former glory by the International Communist Party in its secret activities. Why? Partly to prevent him from becoming disillusioned and potentially ruining the reform movement he knew so much about, and partly, Antelman claims, to retain influence over his network of revolutionary personalities, like Lena Morgenstern. Antelman describes her as a forerunner of women's lib, who organized the first International Women's Congress in 1896 and was involved in peace organizations that he alleges were actually fronts for dissension and revolution. The super-rich, Antelman claims, then sponsored Geiger's magnum opus, Geiger's Urschrift, published in 1857.
So he was brought back into the fold.
Completely, according to Antelman. After his wife's death in 1860, he was sent to Frankfurt, the home turf of the Schiffs and Rothschilds, who Antelman claims controlled its communal life. Geiger's task there was allegedly to control Chief Rabbi Leopold Stein, who refused to toe the party line.
And he even spoke at a Rothschild funeral.
Yes, he delivered the eulogy at James Jacob Rothschild's funeral in 1868. Antelman claims Geiger used the sermon to subtly urge the Rothschilds to finance more institutions of the new type, that is, seminaries designed to fragment and break up Judaism. He quotes Geiger saying, "Let the name of him who had now departed be associated with a new institution of this type."
And finally, he was rewarded.
Finally, Geiger was installed as chief rabbi of Berlin in 1870. This entire sequence, the betrayal, the retaliation, the reinstatement, the rewards highlights, in Antelman's view, the deep manipulation and absolute control exerted over key figures by these super-rich masterminds.
And what about the legacy of Geiger's own seminary, which he eventually did establish in Berlin?
Antelman points to its enduring legacy, stating it produced enemies of authentic Judaism. Among them, he names Felix Adler, the founder of the Society of Ethical Culture, which Antelman claims still supports communist causes. He also names Solomon Schechter.
Schechter, who became head of the Jewish Theological Seminary in America.
The very same. The prime mover of the conservative movement in the U.S., Antelman, claims Schechter contributed significantly to the destruction of authentic Jewish values in the Western world. For Antelman, these institutions, Geiger's in Berlin, JTS in America, were precisely the fraudulent rabbinical seminaries the Bund had planned to create all along.
Now, what's fascinating here, as Antelman pushes his narrative back in time even further, is his claim that the Illuminati's behavior and their revolutionary actions were not new. He argues that the communist idea, as he puts it, had always existed, even preceding Plato's Republic.
Yes, this is where he connects it to even deeper roots. To illustrate this historical continuum of subversion, he draws parallels to much earlier instances.
Like what?
He points to the conflict between the Hellenists and the Hasmoneans in ancient Judea. He asserts that Judah Maccabee wasn't just fighting a foreign Greek government, but subversion in his own country, initiated by the super-rich, specifically naming the Tobiad family, a wealthy priestly family who embraced Hellenism.
So internal corruption fueled by wealth even back then.
That's the parallel he draws. He also mentions Mazdak in 6th century Persia, who, Antelman says, sought to overthrow artisans and entrepreneurs to establish a cooperative society, a kind of proto-communism, but was defeated by the Jewish exilarch, the prince Marzutra. For Antelman, these aren't isolated events, but recurring manifestations of a persistent, anti-religious, revolutionary impulse throughout history.
He also links this historical thread to the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, just 3 years before Weishaupt founded the Illuminati. How does Antelman connect these seemingly disparate events?
It's an intriguing connection he makes. He notes that Pope Clement XIV, when he suppressed the Jesuit order, cited secret grounds which we enclose in our heart, grounds which remain unknown officially. However, Antelman cites St. Alphonsus Liguori, who claimed the suppression was actually due to a plot by Jansenists and infidels, or as Antelman interprets it, Illuminati types and mystical radicals who had infiltrated and come to dominate the Jesuit order from within.
So the Illuminati were already active, undermining institutions before 1776.
That's the implication in Antelman's narrative, that they were part of a long-standing network working to undermine established religious authority from within, even taking over powerful orders like the Jesuits.
This historical narrative then brings us to two pivotal and deeply controversial figures in Jewish history, Sabbatai Tzvi and Jacob Frank. Antelman presents both as false messiahs who promoted something called messianic antinomianism. Can you explain what that term means in this context?
Sure. Messianic antinomianism is basically the radical idea that the arrival of the Messiah, or a messianic age, cancels out the existing religious laws, the nomos. In its most extreme form, which Antelman attributes to these figures, it means that violating the law, even sinning, becomes not just permissible but actually necessary for redemption.
Sinning becomes holy.
In a twisted way, yes. Sabbatai Tzvi, who lived from 1626 to 1676, claimed to be the Messiah, proclaimed certain Jewish laws no longer binding, and spoke against the Talmud. He famously married a prostitute, Sarah, supposedly to fulfill a Kabbalistic legend. He was eventually excommunicated by mainstream rabbis.
And he converted to Islam.
Yes. When imprisoned by the Ottoman Sultan and given the choice between death and conversion, he chose conversion. His followers, however, rationalized this apostasy, forming the Donma sect in Turkey. They developed the belief that the Messiah would have to sin, even descend into the realm of impurity, before he could bring redemption.
And Jacob Frank comes later.
Yes, Jacob Frank, who lived from 1726 to 1791, encountered the Donma in Turkey. Antelman claims Frank took this concept of the Messiah sinning even further. He urged his own followers, the Frankists, to actively sin, reasoning that if salvation could be gotten through purity, it could also be achieved through sin. Antelman explicitly states that they engaged in sexual orgies as part of their rituals.
This sounds incredibly dark.
It's presented as the ultimate inversion of religious morality. Antelman claims these actions were the practical expression of this antinomian impulse, a complete, deliberate rejection of traditional morality to achieve some hidden, perhaps nihilistic goal.
The author further claims that the Donma officially converted to Islam in 1683 and the Frankists to Catholicism in 1759, but these conversions weren't genuine in his view.
Not at all. Antelman asserts these mass conversions were purely strategic, partly for the purpose of imitating the Sabbatian role models like Sabbatai Tzvi, and partly for subverting and destroying these faiths from the inside. He cites Gersham's Golem again here, noting Golem elaborated on this holiness of sin theme and described Frank himself as one of the most frightening phenomena, a religious leader who was a corrupt individual.
This leads Antelman to a deeper dive into Frankist philosophy itself, which he labels the religious myth of nihilism.
Right. He outlines Golem's summary of the 5 distinguishing beliefs of radical Sabbatianism, which he applies to the Frankists. 1. The apostasy conversion of the Messiah is a necessary step. 2. The real Torah is not the real Torah. The written Torah must be violated by conforming to a supposed superior alien mystical Torah called the Torah of Absolute aristocracy. 3. The ultimate first cause and the God of Israel revealed in the Bible are not the same entity. 4. The Godhead actually takes human form, allowing leaders like Frank to claim they were, in a sense, incarnated into the Godhead. 5. And perhaps most practically relevant for a secret society, the believer must not appear as he really is. This justified their double type of life, outwardly conforming while inwardly rejecting everything.
And the ultimate goal of this philosophy.
According to Antelman, citing Golem, it was nothing less than the annihilation of every religion and positive system of belief. They dreamed, he says, of a general revolution that would sweep away the past in a single stroke so that the world might be rebuilt according to their nihilistic vision.
It sounds like pure destruction.
Golem, as quoted by Antelman, described Frank's vision as promoting an anarchic promiscuity of all living things, where the true mystic tramples them underfoot and desecrates them in order to attain the elixir of life. This was understandably seen as demonic possession by the contemporary Jewish community. Frank, Antelman says, preached this religious myth of nihilism in more than 2,000 dogmatic sayings found in publications like Book of the Words of the Lord, which Golem reportedly characterized as a mixture of primitive savagery and putrescent morals.
Antelman provides examples of their twisted interpretations.
Yes, chilling examples. The traditional Jewish blessing, Matir Asuram, meaning he who frees the captives, was twisted by the Frankist cult into Matir Isuram, meaning he who permits the prohibited. A complete inversion.
And others saying,
the subversion of the Torah can become its true fulfillment. And great is the sin committed for its own sake. and from a Talmudic epigram stating the Messiah will come only in an age that is completely guilty or completely innocent, Frankists, Antelman claims, derive the maxim. Since we cannot all be saints, let us all be sinners. These weren't just abstract ideas. Antelman argues they directly inspired the Frankists' actions and their path of deliberate moral transgression and social disruption.
So how did the mainstream Jewish community, the rabbis in Poland, respond to these Frankist tactics?
Antelman says they declared it obligatory for every pious Jew to search and expose them. They fought back. Frank, according to Antelman, used his wife Channa, described as very beautiful, to ensnare hundreds of men into his sect through licentious affairs.
And he was excommunicated.
Yes, in 1756. Antelman recounts an incident where rabbis were supposedly lured to a meeting, locked in a room, and then a nude woman danced in, right in front of their faces, providing the rabbis with the direct evidence they needed. Frank's open talk of revolution also led to his arrest by Polish authorities and exile from Poland.
This conflict also led to public Talmud burnings.
Tragically, yes. Antelman states that Frankists, seeking revenge and favor with the Catholic Church, instigated public burnings of the Talmud in Kamenets in 1757, followed by a chain of burnings in other cities. This wave of destruction only stopped, he says, when their main protector, Bishop Dembowski, died suddenly.
And they were accused of even worse things.
Yes. Antelman claims the Frankists also enticed women to leave their husbands, breaking up hundreds of families, and actively joined Christian bigots in spreading blood libels, the horrific, false accusation that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood for Passover rituals.
He gives a specific example.
He does, in the small town of Vilovich. There, Frankists allegedly impersonated a rabbi's wife to accuse him of ritual murder. This false testimony, Antelman claims, led to the rabbi and his entire congregation being killed and his actual wife and children being tortured until they converted to Christianity. These acts, for Antelman, were not mere religious disagreements. They were deliberate, violent, destructive attacks on the fabric of Jewish life.
Frank himself was eventually baptized.
Yes, in 1759 he was baptized in Warsaw Cathedral, with Emperor Augustus III of Poland acting as his godfather. Quite the symbolic moment. However, his embrace by the church was short-lived. He was imprisoned in 1760 for heresy after church authorities discovered his cult's concept of the Godhead included Frank and other members, not the Christian Trinity. He remained imprisoned until 1773, when the Russian conquest of that part of Poland led to his release.
Antelman also refers to a Frankist coin or medal. What was that about?
He describes a badge or medal mentioned in a rare book, supposedly used by Frankists. He says it resembled Abraham's biblical coin. On one side, it had Hebrew initials meaning an old man, an old lady, a young man, and a virgin. But on the other side were altered initials representing, according to this interpretation, Elijah the prophet, Sabbatai Tzvi, Rabbi Jonathan Eibeshutz, and Jacob Frank himself, under his alias Dobrushka.
Rabbi Jonathan Eibeshutz, the famous scholar.
Yes, Antelman identifies Eibeshutz, a highly respected rabbi in public, as a secret Frankist who led a double life. He says Eibeshutz was exposed by another great rabbi, Jacob Emden, for issuing amulets that invoked Sabbatai Tzvi. This hidden symbolism on the coin, Antelman argues, further illustrates the covert nature of the Frankist movement and its alleged penetration even into mainstream rabbinic circles.
And when Frank requested formal conversion for his followers, he asked for special conditions.
That's right. Antelman notes Frank asked for conditions that would specifically enable his converts to continue to appear secretly as Jews, even after converting to Catholicism. These included not being compelled to shave their sideburns, peo, being allowed to wear traditional Jewish garb, having both Jewish and Christian names, not being forced to eat unkosher food, and being allowed to rest on both Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, and Sunday. All designed, Antelman claims, to facilitate their hidden identity and infiltration.
This leads Antelman to draw a modern parallel.
Yes, he claims that the subversive Temple of Understanding in Washington, D.C., which he says was exposed by columnist Edith Kermit Roosevelt, reveres a Frankist type of connotation. He describes it as having 6 portals depicting Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, and Hinduism, aiming for a kind of religious syncretism. He presents this cult of the all-seeing eye, as he calls it, as a modern continuation of the Frankists' agenda of religious synthesis and ultimately subversion.
This raises an important question Antelman addresses. Why has much of this information about Sabbateanism and Frankism remained relatively obscure, often on the fringes of academic study?
Antelman cites Gershom Scholem's explanation. Skolem suggested that secularist historians often de-emphasize Sabbatianism, partly because many descendants of these movements rose to prominence in the 19th century as intellectuals, great financiers, and men of high political connections.
They wouldn't want their origins exposed.
Exactly. These individuals, Skolem suggested according to Antelman, would have scarcely been expected to approve of attempts to expose their tainted lineage,
Right.
and their wishes likely carried weight. Also, in an age where Jewish scholarship was focused on achieving political emancipation and acceptance, digging into such a controversial and internally divisive past wasn't seen as helpful. And religious Jews, Skolem added, were often reluctant to deal with Sabbatianism due to the painful memory of the subversion of respected rabbis like asserts. This convergence of interests, Antelman implies, created a kind of historical blackout on a crucial conspiracy.
Now, here's where Antelman really starts weaving the Frankist thread directly into the Illuminati and Jacobin narratives, connecting these disparate historical movements into his grand conspiracy theory. He claims that Frank's own nephews, the Frey brothers' children of Frank's cousin Solomon Dobruschka, were Jacobins guillotined in Paris during the Reign of Terror.
Right. And what specific role do these Frankist descendants play in the broader revolutionary narrative Antelman constructs? He details that another nephew, Moses Dobruschka, who converted to Catholicism and took the name Schoenfeld, actually founded the Masonic lodge Asiatische Brüder, Asiatic Brethren. Antelman identifies this as one of 4 Illuminati lodges in Vienna.
So, a direct Frankist-Illuminati link.
That's the claim. Moses Dobruschka, he says, refused the leadership of the Frankist movement after Frank's death, preferring his far greater power as a revolutionary Jacobin. This suggests, for Antelman, a direct continuation and evolution of Frankist ideology into the heart of the European revolutionary movements, merging with Illuminism.
And the Frey brothers who were guillotined.
Antelman claims they were executed due to their shady financial activities involving the East India Corporation, which he tries to link, perhaps tenuously, even to the Boston Tea Party. Their sister Leopoldine married another prominent Jacobin, François Chabot, who was also guillotined. The financial backing for Frank's luxurious lifestyle and the East India Company, Antelman states, came from Illuminati princes, further illustrating, in his view, how deeply intertwined the financial elites were with these revolutionary activities.
Antelman discusses a mysterious letter, the Red Epistle of 1799.
Yes, a letter supposedly circulated from Frank's headquarters in Offenbach after his death, written in red ink. This epistle, he states, exhorted members to embrace the holy religion of Edom, meaning Christianity, but in a subversive way. Skolem, he notes, called it a mystical theory of revolution, while Antelman prefers to call it the Red Kabbalah. He says government officials intercepted it but mistakenly thought it referred to the Jacobins because it contained multiple references to Jacob. For Antelman, this shows the Frankists operating covertly, influencing movements from within, their signals misunderstood by outsiders.
And he revisits Zalkin Arowitz, Mendelssohn's Jacobin disciple.
Right, whom Antelman characterizes harshly as a Jewish anti-Semite due to his open desire for Jewish assimilation and his being a bitter enemy of the Talmud and the rabbinate. He even quotes Zalkin Arowitz accusing a rabbi of being a poisoner to hide crimes related to Jewish burial customs, demonstrating, in Antelman's view, the extreme animosity these figures held towards traditional Judaism.
He then touches on the impact on the French Revolution itself.
Noting that the Jacobins, the revolutionary left, championed the cause of Jewish emancipation, despite its unpopularity with the French masses at the time. This, he suggests, raises the question of significant Jewish money backing them, implying again that the super-rich masterminds were influencing political movements like the French Revolution to further their hidden agenda.
And this enduring hatred, Antelman claims, didn't die out.
No, he claims Frankists and their elite descendants continued to harbor a profound hatred for Torah, true Judaism, the Talmud, and the rabbis, a hatred which, he states, manifests itself to this very day among large segments of the leadership of the conservative and reform movements throughout the diaspora.
He gets very specific about alleged modern influence in American Jewish organizations.
Extremely specific. He states that Frankist descendants dominate the reform movement at many levels and the conservative movement at the highest level. He names the late Reformed clergyman Maurice Eisendrath, claiming he was involved in communist causes and tried to sabotage Zionism. He singles out Abraham Joshua Heschel, a highly respected conservative theologian.
Heschel.
Really? Yes. Antelman claims Heschel was the hero of the New Left's Ramparts magazine and describes Heschel's famous book, The Prophets, as two-faced and crypto-Sabbatian. He alleges It's used as a key text by this subversive elite due to its references to things like Neoplatonism, kings and priests, Greek and Babylonian cults.
Those are very strong accusations against major figures.
They are indeed. He also claims other dominated circles include the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, the American Jewish Congress, and federations of Jewish charities, with lawyers active in these subversively oriented National Lawyers Guild. He's painting a picture of widespread infiltration.
And he points to what he sees as current projects furthering this agenda.
Yes, at the time of writing, early 1970s, he alleges attempts by the American Jewish Congress to destroy Jewish religious day schools. He points to the National Council of Jewish Women as an activist group agitating for women's rights, but claims their goal is to use women's liberation to destroy the role of women in Judaism and the sanctity of traditional services, for example, by trying to count women in prayer quorums, minions, which Jewish law requires be composed of 10 circumcised males.
Also, abortion and affirmative action.
He claims they also agitate for abortion on demand, which he states, according to Judaism, is murder, as well as for affirmative action hiring. For Antelman, these aren't just political positions. They are direct, ongoing manifestations of the anti-religious, family-destroying agenda rooted in Frankism and Communism.
Antelman also describes a kind of trap involving race.
Yes, the trap of racial contamination. He argues that while socialists and communists utilize this Frankist elite, they ultimately plan to exclude them from the millennium by expounding an anti-Semitic doctrine which declared all Jews as belonging to an inferior Jewish race. This meant, conveniently for the communists, according to Antelman, that even baptisms or conversions couldn't remove the taint. It shows, he argues, the ultimate cynical betrayal inherent in the communist movement using its own agents before discarding them based on racial theories reminiscent of Nazism.
He then takes a step back to emphasize the intricate Frankist web he believes he has traced.
Yes, he summarizes the connections he's laid out, relationships between Frankists and the Illuminati, Mendelssohn's circle, including the inner circle working on his German Torah translation, the Bure, Mendelssohn's disciples becoming Jacobins, Jacobins emerging from the Illuminati, who were themselves connected to Frankists. He states he traces Illuministic Frankist families forming the beginnings of the Reform and Conservative movements, and the major elite families forming the inner circles of the Bund der Gerechten, the group he identifies as the International Communist Party, active in the 1848 revolution. It's a complex multi-generational network he's outlining.
He brings up David Friedlander again here.
Right, Friedlander, a prominent figure in Mendelssohn's circle and early Reform Judaism. Antelman states that in 1799, Friedlander wrote an anonymous letter on behalf of several wealthy Jewish families in Berlin. They asked to be received into the Protestant Church, but on conditions of their own specifically, they wanted to be accepted as Christians without Christ, abandoning Jewish ritual but not adopting Christian dogma.
And the Church's response?
The reply, Antelman notes simply, was that such a proposition was meaningless. For Antelman, this episode reveals a profound spiritual emptiness within these assimilated elites, a desire to shed their Jewish identity without truly embracing anything else, symptomatic of the nihilism he traces back to Frank.
Antelman also briefly mentions the Mendelssohn Bank.
Yes, run by Moses Mendelssohn's son Abraham, father of the composer Felix Mendelssohn. He notes it was active in major German and foreign financial dealings, railway issues, state loans, Russian securities. The bank, he adds, was absorbed by Deutsche Bank in 1939 under Nazi pressure. His descendants include notable historians and philosophers. This serves to reinforce the link between this intellectual religious movement and high finance.
And in a rather stark detail, Antelman touches on the Frankist mamzer taint. What does he mean by that?
This refers to a concept in Jewish law, halakha. A mamzer is generally translated as a bastard, specifically a child born from certain forbidden relationships like adultery or incest. Antelman states that because Frankists and Sabbatians allegedly indulged in widespread adultery and sexual license, their children carry the legal taint of mamzerut. This status, according to Jewish law, carries severe restrictions, including prohibitions on marrying within the mainstream Jewish community. They were, he says, shunned by the religious Jewish community. For Antelman, this isn't just social stigma, it's a deep-seated spiritual and legal consequence of the Frankists' deliberate transgressions, leading to generations cut off from authentic Judaism.
However, amidst all this, Antelman does point to one notable rebel within these elite circles.
Yes, he highlights Baron Edmund de Rothschild, son of James, the one whose funeral Geiger spoke at. Antelman praises Edmund as an example of someone who rebelled against his environment. Unlike others in his family, according to Antelman's narrative, Edmund embraced Zionism, poured money into settling the land of Israel and supporting authentic Torah institutions, and pointedly spurned both Geiger's eulogy for his father and the revolutionary teachings of Marx and Engels. For Antelman, Edmund is a rare positive example, someone who broke free from the alleged family legacy of conspiracy and assimilation.
This then brings Antelman to what he sees as a crucial front in this centuries-long war on Judaism, the direct attack on the very foundation of its faith, the Torah itself, through the rise of biblical criticism.
Exactly. He begins this section by quoting a stark Mishnaic teaching. Rejecting the Torah as not from heaven, denying its divine origin means having no share in the world to come, and is tantamount to reviling the Lord. This sets the stakes incredibly high.
And how does he then link this theological concept to a specific historical institution and a key figure in his conspiracy narrative?
He returns to Rabbi Jonathan Eibeshutz, the respected scholar he previously identified as a secret Sabbatian Frankist, and his heretical crypto-Sabbatian theological seminary in Prague. Antelman presents this seminary as a central hub for this intellectual subversion.
A training ground for Bible critics.
That's the idea. He claims Eibeschutz's students were hand-picked, brilliant schemers often raised in Sabbatian families who were secretly tutored in mystical Sabbatian teachings alongside their overt studies. They were then spread over Eastern Europe, posing as legitimate Jewish teachers. He mentions an elaborate communication system of couriers allegedly holding the Sabbatian network together, and a confiscated letter from a Sabbatian prophet, Judah Prosnitz, to Eibeshutz, supposedly prophesying Eibeshutz himself as the Messiah. For Antelman, this seminary was the breeding ground for individuals tasked with undermining the Torah's authority from within academia.
And the seminary, Antelman claims, wasn't just a place of academic heresy, but also of violence.
Yes, he alleges that around 1720, Eibeschutz's students physically vandalized Rabbi Oppenheim's yeshiva in Prague, assaulting students and demolishing the study hall. He says Rabbi Oppenheim's students retaliated, possibly even killing some of Eibeschutz's students, leading to an imperial edict from Charles VI of Austria demanding an end to the feud in 1772. This paints a picture of intense, violent conflict surrounding these figures.
From this volatile environment, Antelman introduces a figure named Carl Anton.
Carl Anton, whom Antelman identifies as a star pupil of Eibeschutz's yeshiva and a Frankist. Anton converted to Christianity and became a professor of Hebrew at the University of Helmstedt in Germany. His real assignment, Antelman claims, was to discredit the Bible. He also asserts that painstaking efforts were made to obscure his activities in historical records, suggesting a cover-up. For Antelman, Anton represents the deliberate placement of Frankist agents within Christian academia to execute the anti-religious agenda through scholarly means.
Antelman then lays out what he calls Anton's ambitious century-long blueprint to destroy the Bible, or BDG. This was supposedly meant to be carried out by a closed circle of intellectuals, mainly academics. What were the key strategies?
He outlines a 7-point plan attributed to Anton. 1. Develop a closed circle of intellectuals, academicians, dedicated to destroying the Bible's authority. 2. Control the dissemination of vital information for biblical studies by gaining positions of authority in scholastic publications, libraries, and archives. Gatekeeping, essentially. 3. Ensure that all members of the network, Illuminati, Frankists, revolutionaries, promote the career advancement of BDG members. 4. The BDG must be self-perpetuating, with each member obligated to produce at least one replacement disciple. 5. Utilize revolutionary media outlets to disseminate BDG propaganda to the wider public. 6. Encourage non-BDG anti-Bible thinkers, identify them, and catapult them into important positions to amplify their message. 7. Systematically destroy the careers and reputations of dissenting academicians who uphold the Bible's integrity. For Antelman, this wasn't just academic debate. It was a strategic, covert, long-term campaign for intellectual subversion. The author then tries to illustrate this alleged plan in action with specific examples. Yes, he points to Moses Dobruschka, Frank's nephew, the Jacobin Illuminati figure, being appointed director of the Vienna Library Archives in 1782, and Zalkin Arowitz, Mendelssohn's disciple, becoming Secretary of Oriental Languages at the Royal Library in Paris in 1789. Also, Ferdinand Hitzig, whom Antelman identifies as a descendant of the Hitzig banking family, connected to Mendelssohn, becoming a biblical scholar. These appointments, for Antelman, demonstrate the placement of agents in key intellectual gatekeeping positions, fulfilling point 2 of the blueprint.
And he connects this to the origins of the documentary hypothesis.
Directly. He notes that Jean Astruc, a French physician, made initial contact with Sabbatians, according to Antelman, and in 1753 postulated the first documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Pentateuch was a compilation of separate documents, just 1 year after Carl Anton publicly defended Eibeschutz against Rabbi Emden's accusations. Antelman emphasizes this timing as evidence of coordination. He also names Jena and Göttingen universities as becoming centers of anti-biblical rhetoric.
And Eibeschutz himself maintained his cover.
Antelman claims Eibeschutz publicly excommunicated Sabbatians and played dumb about the yeshiva violence, all while his students like Anton were actively attacking Judaism and rabbis, Anton accusing rabbis of applying the Golden Rule only to fellow Jews. This duplicity, for Antelman, is further proof of the deceptive double life led by these key figures.
Turning to the specific figures of biblical criticism Antelman discusses, he first focuses on Johann David Michaelis, 1717 to 1791. What was his alleged role?
Michaelis was an editor of a prominent biblical exegesis journal who, Antelman says, openly denigrated Jews. His public arguments with Moses Mendelssohn, Antelman claims, were merely conspiratorial theater, cleverly designed to make Mendelssohn famous as a moderate spokesman for Jewish emancipation, thereby furthering the assimilationist agenda. For instance, Michaelis tried to statistically prove Jews were 25 times as corrupt as Germans in thievery. Mendelssohn refuted this by comparing similar social classes and arguing Jews often stole from sheer necessity due to poverty and discrimination. This debate raised Mendelssohn's profile. Michaelis also wrote a book on the New Testament in 1750 and significantly suggested archaeological excavation in the Near East with the implicit goal, Antelman argues, that discoveries would be interpreted and reported in the media from the standpoint of disproving the Bible.
Next, Judah ben Zeev, 1764 to 1811.
Antelman describes him as the first Jewish scholar to apply Western research methods to the study of Hebrew. He claims Ben Zeev was forced to leave his native Krakow by the rabbis there because of his heresies, thus marking him, in Antelman's view, as aligned with the anti-Torah agenda.
Then J.G. Eichhorn, 1752-1827.
Eichhorn was a professor of Oriental Studies at both Jena and Göttingen, the universities Antelman identified as hotbeds of anti-biblical rhetoric. Antelman alleges Eichhorn influenced Moses Mendelssohn and notes that Eichhorn's colleague, G. Herder, was a known Illuminati member. These academic connections are presented as evidence of the network expanding into influential university positions.
Following Eichhorn came Wilhelm de Wet, 1780 to 1849. His 1805 PhD dissertation made a major claim about the Book of Deuteronomy.
Yes, de Wet famously claimed the entire Book of Deuteronomy was written much later than the time of Moses, specifically around the time of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE.
And how does Antelman challenge this foundational thesis of modern biblical criticism?
He argues forcefully that this thesis would have been put down as absurd if it had received proper critical exposure at the time. He claims the Illuminati and Jacobins simply seized anything they could to break the authority of the Bible, just as he alleges their later disciples misused Darwin's Origin of the Species to undermine the Bible, in spite of the fact that Darwin himself believed that God created man.
What specific flaws does Antelman point out in de Wet's argument?
Antelman claims de Wet overlooks some basic facts in the biblical account itself, the 2 Kings 22.3, which states the Torah scroll was found by the high priest Chilkiyahu during temple renovations in Josiah's time, not written then. He points to the ancient scribal dynasty, Shaphan, Meshullam, Ezra, as guardians of the authentic Masoretic text over centuries. He also highlights what he sees as de Wet's critical chronological error, arguing that verses from Deuteronomy were cited by prophets generations before Josiah's time, making de Wet's dating impossible. De Wet was eventually dismissed from his post in Berlin for his liberal views, a consequence Antelman attributes to his subversive scholarship.
After de Wet, Antelman claims 19th century biblical criticism was dominated by Julius Wellhausen, 1844-1918.
Yes, Wellhausen is famous for refining the documentary hypothesis, often called the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis. This theory posits that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, was woven together from 4 distinct source documents, labeled J, E, D, and P. The D source is directly linked to de Wet's thesis about Deuteronomy.
And Antelman's view on this hugely influential theory.
He dismisses it outright. He emphatically states that this theory has never been scientifically proven. On the contrary, it has been discredited many times by competent biblical scholars. He lists several refutations. Despite this, he argues, it still holds on, because radicals and their fellow travelers have decided that it should be deemed valid. For Antelman, the persistence of the Wellhausen hypothesis despite refutation is primary evidence of the BDG's success in controlling academic narratives and suppressing opposing views.
Another key figure Antelman discusses is Moritz Steinschneider, 1816–1907. What actions and beliefs does Antelman attribute to him?
Steinschneider was a pioneer of Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism, a field advocated by Geiger, and hailed from the Sabbatian center of Prague. Though ordained as a rabbi, Antelman claims that late in life, Steinschneider expressed his bleak view of Judaism's future. We have only one task left to give the remains of Judaism a decent burial, regarding ideas of a Jewish Renaissance as nonsense.
He was involved in secret societies and politics, too.
Antelman claims he founded a secret society called Unity, 1836–1842, supposedly Zionist, but which Austrian police deemed a secret society with destructive and reformist tendencies. Steinschneider himself, Antelman asserts, was actually an anti-Zionist, stating Zionism was more dangerous than anti-Semitism. He was reportedly found building barricades during the Communist Revolution of 1848 in Berlin, and Antelman claims he broke security later in life by revealing certain relationships in a biography, ending a 40-year friendship. This combination of anti-traditionalist views, revolutionary activity, and perceived untrustworthiness firmly places him within the conspiratorial network in Antelman's eyes.
Antelman also presents a contrast between two other biblical critics, Ephraim Speiser and Yechezkel Kaufman.
Yes, Ephraim Speiser, a prominent 20th century biblical critic and editor of the influential Anchor Bible series, is described by Antelman simply as being full of blasphemy. Yechezkel Kaufman, another major 20th century Israeli Bible scholar, is noted differently. While Kaufman did subscribe to aspects of Wellhausen's hypothesis, Antelman points out that Kaufman strongly argued against the idea that Israelite monotheism evolved gradually out of paganism, insisting it was a radical break. Antelman seems to present Kaufman as someone who accepted some critical methodology but resisted its most extreme anti-religious conclusions.
And how does Antelman characterize the conservative movement's stance on biblical criticism?
He states that the conservative movement broadly embraced the works of scholars like Speiser, Kaufman, and Steinschneider. He points to Solomon Schechter, the key architect of conservative Judaism in America,
whom Antelman earlier identified as a product of Geiger's seminary.
Exactly. Schechter is noted for having famously called biblical criticism higher anti-Semitism, recognizing its destructive potential. Yet, Antelman claims Schechter simultaneously agreed with the idea that God did not write the Torah. This, for Antelman, is the ultimate contradiction and a key indicator of the conservative movement's alleged complicity in undermining the Torah's divine authority, even while outwardly appearing to defend traditional Judaism.
What's perhaps most striking here is Antelman's claim that numerous scholarly refutations of these critical theories have been systematically ignored.
He insists on this point. He lists numerous biblical scholars, J. Robertson, James Orr, W. L. Baxter, H. M. Wiener, D. Hoffman, Elihu Schatz, as well as the Orientalist A. H. Sayce, who, he claims, successfully refuted the documentary hypothesis. Yet, Antelman states their works are routinely ignored by university faculties worldwide. This allows, he argues, the accumulated blasphemies as to the integrity of the Hebrew Bible to persist. For Antelman, this isn't a simple academic disagreement or the natural evolution of scholarship. It's proof of a deliberate suppression of dissenting views, orchestrated by the very forces he claims are controlling academia to advance their anti-religious, Bible-destroying agenda outlined in Anton's blueprint.
So, as we conclude this deep dive, we've really journeyed through Rabbi Marvin S. Antelman's complex, detailed, and let's face it, deeply provocative claims in To Eliminate the Opiate, Volume 1.
Absolutely. We've traced his purported secret conspiracy from what he sees as its ancient roots in Plato's philosophy and Hellenism, through the alleged machinations of the Illuminati and the Buddha-Gerechten, and deep into the dark nihilistic path of the Frankist movement.
We've seen how Antelman connects these threads, these secret societies and ideological currents, to the rise of reform and conservative Judaism, which he explicitly labels phony Judaisms.
And how he links them to the origins of biblical criticism, presenting all these developments as interconnected parts of a broader, continuous communist agenda aimed squarely at dismantling religious and moral order, with Judaism as a primary target.
His narrative is undeniably dense, it's incredibly detailed, and it presents this sweeping, almost overwhelming, interconnected vision of historical forces and hidden agendas, all supposedly driven by these figures he identifies as super-rich masterminds.
And the author's stated intent, as we noted, is to enlighten readers about this conspiracy. He claims that the very act of reading his book itself completely undermines the conspiracy, because its power, he asserts, depends on being able to hide its inner workings. By bringing these alleged connections into light, he believes he's helping to disarm it.
This deep dive has really laid bare one author's intricate and, it's fair to say, deeply held perspective on centuries of historical events and the nature of hidden power dynamics. It's a specific and challenging lens through which to view history.
It certainly is, and it leaves us, and you the listener, with some significant questions. In a world awash with information, with countless interpretations of history, how do we approach narratives like this? How do we evaluate claims, especially ones that challenge conventional understandings of power, religion, and identity, so profoundly?
What responsibilities come with analyzing such narratives? What new questions does a perspective this specific, this detailed, this controversial provoke for you about the stories we tell and the stories that perhaps remain hidden about our past and our present?